Good evening and welcome back to our Cloud of Witnesses study. I hope that you're having a great week. It's been a quite cold and rainy week thus far, but we can always use the rain, and I'm grateful that we have warm, dry places in which to be this evening or whenever you happen to be tuning into the class. I'm grateful that we have the electronic technology that allows us to connect in this way. And just grateful for this time to be together again, devoting ourselves to the Word of God, and also considering in particular men and women of the past, men and women of faith who serve as great examples for us, great encouragement, great inspiration for us, because we know that they were men and women just like us. We know that despite their failings, despite their flaws, they were seeking with all their heart to serve God, just as we are. And so I hope that you're finding this study to be encouraging to you, enlightening to you, visiting some texts maybe that you haven't visited in a while. And perhaps that will be the case tonight as we talk about someone that maybe as a standalone individual, we don't discuss all that often, only in connection with other people. And that is Jonathan. So if you'll be turning to the book of 1 Samuel, I'll go ahead and share some things while you're turning there, either in your print Bible or in your electronic Bible. And the first way we know Jonathan is as Saul's son, Saul, the first king of Israel. We assume that Jonathan is the oldest of his several sons because Jonathan's name is almost mentioned first. And this takes us back to a time a little over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. Saul becomes king of Israel about 1050 BC. And by the time Jonathan's name is first mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 13, things have already started to go south for Saul as Israel's first king. Saul started out as such a humble individual, somebody who had his head screwed on right in regard to who he was in relationship to his God. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 9, when the prophet Samuel first starts talking to Saul about what was to come, Saul answers in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 21, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel, and is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such things to me? And then in the next chapter, chapter 10, when he is to be brought out, having already been anointed by Samuel as Israel's first king, at the point at which he's going to be introduced to the people of Israel, it says in verse 20 of 1 Samuel 10, when Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought forth the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? Is this man even among us? And the Lord said, yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. Saul had to be drugged, almost kicking and screaming, before the people of Israel to be introduced as their king. He was such an imposing physical man, a head taller than anyone else around him. And yet at this point in his life, he still had a very meek and humble heart, but that changes so very quickly. So by the time Jonathan's name is first mentioned, just 3 chapters later, 1 Samuel chapter 13, Saul has already been told by Samuel that because of Saul's presumptuousness, because of his pride, because of what he dared to do and not waiting for Samuel and going ahead and offering a sacrifice to God and inquiring of him, because of that, he had been rejected by God. And I'm sure God knew what was already in Saul's heart and the things that were going to transpire later. And so Saul has been told that his kingship would not endure, there would be no dynasty within his family, and that the Lord was seeking out a man after his own heart. We know who that's ultimately going to be. That's going to be David. And while that is the case, I truly feel that Jonathan had that same kind of heart. I think he had the kind of heart that would have found favor with God had he ultimately succeeded his father in becoming the king, and that he would have been pleasing to God. I think Jonathan would have been an incredible king, and he certainly acts repeatedly. He acts selflessly on behalf of other people. And he does that exponentially more than his father Saul ever did. And he even does that more than David will ultimately do on many occasions. Again, I mentioned a moment ago that Jonathan was the oldest of Saul's sons. There were at least two other sons, potentially four other sons, depending on how we view the texts that we have in 1 Samuel and also in 1 Chronicles. 1 Samuel mentions Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua, and 1 Chronicles 8:33 also mentions Abinadab and Eshbaal. So unless those are other names for those other two sons of Saul, then there are five sons rather than just three. And at least two daughters are born to Saul and his wife Ahinoam. Their names are Merib and Michal, and they certainly play into the story as David enters the narrative a little later. And then Saul also has another two sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, born to him by a concubine named Rizpah. You read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 21. Verse 8. This is another Mephibosheth, and it's possible that Jonathan names his son Mephibosheth after his half-brother. We don't know if Jonathan was tall and dark and handsome like his father Saul was, but he could have favored his dad. And at the point we're introduced to Jonathan, this is at a time when Israel is very much still greatly dispossessed by their Philistine overlords. Understand that when Saul becomes king of Israel, Israel is not some powerhouse kingdom. They are still very much a tribal people. There's not even a capital, even though we will find Saul frequently at places like Gibeah. There is no capital of the kingdom. And they are so dispossessed by the Philistine overlords that there aren't even any blacksmiths or iron workers in Israel. If they wanted their farming tools or other implements sharpened, they had to take those to Philistines to have that work done. In fact, the entire people of Israel, the army of Israel at that time, has no weapons. Only Saul and Jonathan were in possession of the only swords or spears among them. While at one point Saul had a force of about 3,000, it dwindles down to a group of about 600 at the time. And that was when Jonathan slipped away from the camp with his armor bearer to engage a Philistine garrison. Now, understand, he's already the son of the king. Saul has gained at least one victory at this point in rescuing the people of Jabesh Gilead, but things are going badly for Israel under Saul's leadership, and the prospects don't look great. And it's at this point that Jonathan, the subject of our study tonight, demonstrates such great faith and bravery and courage and skill as a warrior and confidence in the Lord his God. And he doesn't do this presumptuously. He doesn't just assume that because he's going out on an endeavor that God is obligated to bless that. And again, that just shows me the great humility of heart that he has. So I want you to begin reading with me tonight in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6. Jonathan said, this is 1 Samuel 14:6, Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." He says, perhaps God will. I want God to do this, but just because I'm setting out on this mission doesn't mean that God's obligated to bless it. But he knows that even with himself and his armor bearer, if God chose to, God could give them victory. And maybe he remembers stories like that of Gideon that took place in the historical period just prior to this, the time of the judges. If you go back and look at the timeline, Gideon's victory that God gave him over the Midianites had only happened a little over 100 years earlier. So if you think back from the present, 2020, back to something that happened in the 19 teens or about 1920, that's about how long it's been since Gideon had led the people of God and when God used Gideon to bring such great victory. So maybe Jonathan has that in mind. So we keep reading here in 1 Samuel 14. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said to Jonathan. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. And I think even at this point, we learn something about Jonathan's character, how people saw him. His armor bearer, I don't know how long they had been in that particular military relationship, but he seems willing to die with Jonathan, if that's what it was going to take. I am with you, heart and soul. No second guessing, no questioning your leadership. You can count on me to be right beside you. Verse 8, Jonathan said, come on then, we'll cross over to them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we'll stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they are hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we will teach you a lesson. Jonathan saw that as a sign from God that he was with him. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Verse 13, Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. An incredible victory just at the hands of these two men, and that ignites a spark within the army of Israel. They suddenly believe that, yes, indeed, God is with us, and they joined in the battle. If you look at verse 23 of 1 Samuel 14, so on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. The Lord gave them that victory. It's not going to take very much for Saul to start thinking that it was his. But Jonathan was the catalyst and the spark that inspired the others to fight. Saul is going to foolishly say and is going to selfishly forbid anyone to eat anything that day. And he pronounces a curse upon anyone who did, until he had avenged himself upon his enemies. Saul is such a diva at this point. Everything just seems to revolve around him. This is what he says in verse 24 of 1 Samuel 14. The Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats any food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. They're going to lack strength. They're going to lack energy to enter the battle because of this foolish curse that Saul places upon the circumstances. Jonathan isn't there because he's out doing battle. And so because he's not there, he doesn't get the word. And while he's walking through the forest, he comes across honey and a honeycomb on the ground. He sticks the end of his staff into it, brings it to his mouth, and he's refreshed and his eyes brighten. That is, he is immediately energized by this. And a little later in the story, Saul compounds his foolishness by vowing that if anybody had violated the ban that he had imposed, that person would be put to death, even if it were Jonathan. And at that point in the story, Saul has tried to inquire of the Lord. There is no answer. He assumes that there is some sort of problem in the camp, some sort of breach of trust and faithfulness with God. And so lots are cast. Ultimately, Jonathan and Saul are taken. Lots are cast between them, and Jonathan is identified. And Saul is adamant that his brave, courageous, faithful son, who has instigated and served as a catalyst for this victory, he's going to have to die because he was found to be in violation of his own foolish vow. Jonathan's attitude is, well, if that's what you said, I guess that's what's going to have to take place. I guess I'm just going to have to die. Jonathan doesn't think this is unjust. He's been happy to do anything he could to bring victory to God's people. Verse 43 of 1 Samuel 14, Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." He seems to be willing to go to his death. Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." Talk about a man with little wisdom, no discernment, totally egotistical. That is Saul at this point, willing even to put his son to death. And that's where we learn even more about the character of Jonathan and how he was viewed by other people. Look at verse 45 of 1 Samuel 14. After Saul had, my eyes jumped down 2 verses too far. Verse 45, but the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die? He who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. What impresses me is what these men were willing to risk for the sake of Jonathan. They risked their own lives. This was the king. If Saul's going to put his own son to death, he's not going to blink about putting them to death. But they knew what a hothead Saul was. They knew how violent and rash and impulsive he could be. They knew that they could incur his wrath, but they're going to risk it anyway. And I think it's because of their love and their admiration and respect for Jonathan that they were willing to put their necks on the line for him, that they would defy their king for him and basically say, "Saul, if you're going to put him to death, you're going to have to go through us first. We're not going to let harm come to a hair of his head." I think that's got to tell us something about Jonathan's character, how much he was admired and respected, far above the admiration and the respect that Saul's men had for him. And then we get introduced to Jonathan as this devoted friend and companion of David. We can assume, maybe safely, that Jonathan, and remember our timetable here, we were just reading from 1 Samuel 14. It's going to be in 1 Samuel 16, just 2 chapters later, when Samuel goes to Bethlehem and anoints David as Israel's future king. It's going to be the next chapter, 1 Samuel 17, when we have the record of the battle at the Valley of Elah, where with the help of the Lord, David slays the giant Goliath. And we can assume, since Jonathan was a part of the army of Israel, that he has been there at the Valley of Elah with his father the entire time. And he has heard those twice daily taunts from the champion of the Philistines, Goliath of Gath, daring them, just mocking them, boasting that they lack the courage. They lack a man to send out to him to meet in battle. He does it morning and evening for 40 days, 80 times that boast and that challenge is given. And as wonderful as Jonathan is, he doesn't take up the challenge either, nor does Saul, nor do David's 3 oldest brothers who are there with the army. And you remember how David's father Jesse sends him to the battle line He thinks it's a battle line. No fighting's going on, with provisions for his brothers, for their captain. And Jonathan was probably watching with the rest in amazement as David ran toward this 9'9" giant. And he's armed only with a sling and 5 smooth stones. And then after Goliath is felled by that one stone, and David takes Goliath's sword and cuts off his head, and then the battle is on, the rout is on. Jonathan undoubtedly joins in the pursuit of the Philistine army, and is present when David appeared before Saul after the battle. The text said that when David comes back, he's still got Goliath's head in his hand. That brings us, that would be the end of chapter 17. So look with me at the first few verses of 1 Samuel 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. This is just incredible to me, because Jonathan would be the heir apparent to the throne. He's the oldest son. And this just lets us see that so clearly into his heart of humility, his heart of selflessness. We're told that just this friendship, this devotion is struck in an instant. Jonathan loved David as himself. His soul was knit to David. They make this covenant together, and he gives him basically all the signs that would be his, all the indications that he had, that he was the crown prince of Israel: his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. He was also about to become David's brother-in-law through David's marriage to his sister Michal. And these actions are just so countercultural, talking about human nature and human culture in general. So countercultural, so counterintuitive. It was as much so 1,000 years before Christ as it is now. From a worldly perspective, Jonathan had everything to lose by entering into a relationship like this with David. How could a man who is next in line to the throne do something like that? By human standards, he should have seen David as a threat and as a rival. But rather, we see such great humility. We see a total lack of jealousy, so unlike his father, so unlike Saul. And it's wonderful to see that, yeah, apples can fall far from the tree from which they come. Sometimes that's not the case. I love that it's the case with Jonathan. He doesn't share his father's heart. He doesn't share his father's character. And I think this is a real test for us. When you see the crown prince noticing David and all the adulation that he's giving, and the popular song that begins to be sung, that Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s, you know how angry that makes Saul. But at least Saul makes the first verse, the first stanza of the song. Jonathan's name doesn't come up in the song at all. And yet I love Jonathan's response to that. And it's a challenge to me, and I would like for you to do the same kind of self-examination that I'm trying to do in asking ourselves, what is our response when someone else is honored? What is our response when someone else is the recipient of great blessing? Does it ever bother us when things go well for other people? Maybe when things aren't going so well for us. And yet that's the way it's supposed to be in the body of Christ, in our relationships with one another. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 26, being a parallel section of text to Romans chapter 12, both of which talk about the church of the Lord Jesus Christ in terms of a physical body with different parts and members and organs and systems and functions, yet all working together in complementary fashion, working interdependently for the good of the body. 1 Corinthians 12:26 says that if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. And I hope that's an ongoing part of our Christian growth and development and maturity, is that we can truly and genuinely feel nothing but joy with no jealousy, when something wonderful happens to someone within the body, someone within the family, because as they are honored, we are honored. He has no jealousy over David's defeat of Goliath, no thinking that, that should have been me. I don't know what kept me from going out to meet him. I don't know why I didn't trust in the Lord as much as David did. I don't know why I wasn't quite as courageous as he was, but that should have been me. They should be singing about me. Jonathan doesn't feel that way. His father does. Chapter 18, verse 9, in response to the song that was being sung, from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. From that time on, David was an object of suspicion. And this is where Jonathan begins to demonstrate just the kind of depth of commitment and friendship that he has with David. Proverbs 18:24 says that there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And that's Jonathan to David. I don't know about the relationship that Jonathan had with Ishvi and Malchishua and Abinadab and Ethbaal. I don't know what kind of relationship that they had. I know he's going to die. We'll get to that later. 1 Samuel chapter 31. He's going to die in battle with two of his brothers and with his father. But we know about David's relationship with his brothers. He's the youngest. He's not even on the radar when Samuel comes to Bethlehem looking for the next king of Israel from among Jesse's sons. After the first seven are run through, he has to ask, is that all your boys? Do you have any more sons? David's not even in the picture. He's out with the flocks. And you remember his brother's response when he got to the valley of Elah. His brothers start getting defensive. David's gone there to see this great battle that's taking place, and he sees his three oldest brothers cowering in fear like everyone else. And his brothers take offense. Well, why have you come here? Who did you leave those sheep with? We just sense tension in that relationship. And yet, beyond blood kin, these two men, Jonathan and David, have this incredibly committed friendship and relationship. And Jonathan's attitude, I see it as a lot like the attitude of John the Baptist. We were able to talk about John. I think it was just a couple of weeks ago. And you remember the point in John's Gospel, chapter 3, where the disciples of John the Baptist start getting their feelings hurt. They start feeling a little slighted because lesser crowds are coming to John. Greater crowds are starting to go to Jesus. And so they say to John in John chapter 3, verse 26, they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testified about, look, he's baptizing and everyone's going to him. And they felt hurt by that. They wanted John to feel hurt by it too. And his response is so beautiful. To this, John replied, verse 27, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah, but I'm sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him, and he's full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater. I must become less. He must increase. I must decrease. and just how John knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was the Messiah. Jonathan already knows. He'll articulate it later in the story, but Jonathan already knows that David is going to be the next king. And he doesn't know how he's going to die at this point. He doesn't know when that death is going to come, but he envisions himself as being David's second in command, being his right-hand man, his faithful advisor and counselor and defender. And Jonathan was more than happy for David to have that honor. I will be blessed as I see you blessed. It takes quite a man to step out of the limelight and to just be an encourager, to help ensure the success of someone else. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. That's Jonathan. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. If Jonathan were looking out for his own personal interests, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing with David and for David. Romans chapter 12, verse 10, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. We were reading from 1 Samuel chapter 18 just a moment ago. If you'll flip over one more chapter, the 1 Samuel chapter 19, we'll read the first few verses of that chapter together as well. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. That's how quickly this is digressed. Saul was the one who wanted David brought into his court. He loved the way he played his lyre or his harp. He was initially grateful for the victory that had come through David's defeat of Goliath. But then came the song, and to the point that his oldest daughter, Merab, who was supposed to have been given to David to marry, he sends her off to marry someone else. Then it galls him to find out that his other daughter, Michal, is madly in love with David. He says, well, you can marry her if you'll bring me the foreskins of 200 Philistines. And he does that in order to cause the death of David. He's trying to kill David. He's going to try to impale him with a spear twice. He'll set guards outside his house to assassinate him when he walks out the next morning. And he gets to the point, it's not just subversively that he wants this done. He overtly tells Jonathan and his attendants to kill David. So that's verse 1 of 1 Samuel 19. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into a hiding place and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I will speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. And then verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. He listens to Jonathan momentarily, but he will soon once again be seeking David's life. This is where Jonathan proves again that he will choose loyalty to David over blood loyalty to his father. He was basically ordered by his father to kill David. Jonathan knew that he couldn't do that. And he will even try to kill Jonathan because of his connection to David. When Jonathan explains why David is not at the new moon feast, Saul takes the same spear, I assume the same spear that he had thrown twice at David, and tries to kill his son. Remember when he was willing to kill Jonathan before, just sort of to save face, and because his own pride had been injured? Now he hurls this spear at his own son, right after saying, he's trying to take your place on the throne. Well, Jonathan can't sit on the throne if he's dead, and yet his father throws the spear at him. And at this point, I'm thinking, you don't want Saul on your javelin team. If you're putting together an Israelite Olympic team, Saul does not need to be on that javelin team. We know of 3 attempts that failed, 2 with David, 1 with Jonathan. So look down with me now, if you would, at chapter 20, verses 41 and 42. This is where David has been hiding out in the field, and Jonathan shoots arrows for his young attendant to go retrieve. David gets the message that the conversation with my father didn't go well. You need to run, you need to flee, but they have a personal meeting before David leaves. Verse 41, after the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Even before they could embrace or kiss, David has so much mutual respect and reciprocal regard and devotion and loyalty to Jonathan that the future king bows down to the ground before Jonathan 3 times. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have a sworn friendship with one another in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me and between your descendants and my descendants forever." Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. The next time they meet, and they, I don't know if David thought this was the last time they would see one another or not. I think both of them are probably thinking, we'll get beyond all of this, and I'll be the king and you'll be my right-hand man. When Saul is still seeking to kill David, Jonathan goes out to meet him in the desert, the wilderness of Ziph. And this is in 1 Samuel 23, beginning in verse 14. If you'll read these few verses with me. David stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Another translation says he encouraged him in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The 2 of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. Again, his concern is not for himself. His concern is for his friend who's been running for his life, who's been hiding out in the wilderness, who's been hiding in caves. And he goes to him and he strengthens him in the Lord. He encourages him in God. And sadly, that was the last time they saw one another. Jonathan's life is going to come to an end on Mount Gilboa while once again fighting against the Philistines with his father and with 2 of his brothers. If you'll notice 1 Samuel chapter 31, beginning in verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically, and he will ultimately take his own life rather than be taken for spoil and taken as sport by the Philistines. It's in the first chapter of 2 Samuel that we read about David learning about the death of Saul and the death of Jonathan. And We'll just start reading in verse 17 of 2 Samuel 1. This is David's lament. And notice as we read through this together, as much as he truly loved Jonathan, and as much as Saul had sought to do him harm, he still has such great praise for the Lord's anointed, against whom he refused to raise his own hand. Earlier in the story, he had two opportunities. Saul was right there. He could have taken his life, but he refused to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. And that's why this Amalekite is put to death, who claims to have done that, who claims to have put Saul out of his misery and taken his life. When they get the news in verse 11, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And then verse 17, David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow, as it is written in the book of Jashar. He wants everybody to learn this song, to commit it to mind, to commit it to heart. Verse 19, a gazelle lies slain at your hearts, on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, one of the garrison cities of the Philistines, Goliath's hometown. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life, they were loved and admired, and in death, they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And even though he's attributing this to both of them, I know David's broken heart has got to be thinking about his beloved friend Jonathan, and less so about his father Saul. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your hearts. And then so beautifully and movingly, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than the love of women. He knew that this devotion was deeper than even the closest and most intimate relationships that we think of in this life. And then again, verse 27, how the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. That verse 26, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. Reading that from the Message, it reads, oh, my dear brother Jonathan, I am crushed by your death. Your friendship was a miracle wonder, love far exceeding anything I've known or ever hoped to know. I think we find in Jonathan not just a dear devoted friend of David, not just a man who chose loyalty to a righteous man over loyalty to an unrighteous father. I think we truly see him as a man of faith in God. He knew that God didn't owe him a divine blessing on everything that he attempted, but I think he was astute enough, he was discerning enough to know the Lord's will in this matter, that David was God's hand-chosen successor to Jonathan's father, Saul, and Jonathan couldn't oppose that. If David was God's chosen king, who was he to stand in the way? He wanted his will to align with the Father's will, and if it's your will for David to be king, I'll make that my will too, and I'll do everything that I can to make him successful, to spare him from these attempts on his life by my father. Very familiar words to us from 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. We know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. We ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and our sisters. Remember how others had risked their lives for Jonathan when his father wanted to put him to death. They say you'll have to go through us first. Not a hair of his head is going to be touched. They risk their lives for him, and Jonathan in turn will risk his life for David. And while we'll rarely be called upon to do that in a physical way for one another, to lay down our life so that a brother or sister in Christ might survive, we're called upon to do something that I think is in many ways far more demanding, and something that we're called upon to do constantly and repeatedly. And that's to lay down our lives for one another in service and in honor and in love for one another. Jesus said in John 15:13, greater love has no one than this, than one lay down his life for his friends. Jesus was going to do that in a way that only he could do. And in bidding us to follow his example, he calls us to lay down our lives for one another as brothers and sisters, as friends in Jesus Christ. Thanks again for devoting the time to be a part of this study. I hope that maybe we were able to go back and look at some texts that we don't get to cover frequently together. And I look forward to continuing the study with you next week. Be looking to see you on Sunday, either through the live stream or in person in the auditorium. God bless you and have a wonderful evening.